Tonight, Mary Eberstadt is going to talk. Mary is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., having served previously as a fellow for many years at the Hoover Institution. She has done a lot of interesting editorial work. She's been consulting editor to the Policy Review, the Hoover Institution publication. Before that, she was executive editor of the National Interest, and before that, managing editor of that wonderful journal, The Public Interest, which had such a, so many great contributions to American public policy over the years. She graduated from Cornell in 1983, where she was a Telluride scholar. She's done, besides her editing work, done a lot of different articles, really interesting articles on a wide variety of topics, and as well as a number of books. She did her first fiction book a couple of years ago called The Loser Letters, which is what we call a contemporary sequel and updating of the Screwtape Letters of C.S. Lewis. And for those of you who are able to do it, and after you're enthused by her talk tonight, tomorrow at Duke at the Divinity School at 12:20, she's going to have an informal conversation on the Loser Letters. And some of you may have a chance to attend that. Most recently, she's published the book Adam and Eve After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution. And that's going to be the basis for much of what she says tonight. So we're very grateful for Mary's willingness to come down to this lovely area of the Triangle and to inform us about the topic that she'll be speaking on tonight, which is After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution.
Thank you. Thanks to the Thomistic International Center, to the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and to the Love and Fidelity Network for making this happen. I'm delighted to be here tonight. I want to say first that unlike Chris here and some of the other distinguished people in the room, I am not a professor. I'm not going to play one on campus. I'm instead a researcher who has felt driven to write since I was small. Someone who sits in a corner and scribbles when time allows, and who's been fortunate enough from time to time to find people who will publish my work. Until recently, almost all of my work was in the strictly secular realm, including a couple of stints as speechwriter. Journalism, politics, and other items outside the realm of theology and religion. This is not because I'm a secular person, but because the secular realm was where I first started working, and it became something of a habit. Something happened that changed that, and that's part of what I'm here to tell you about. Now, you're probably starting to wonder, if she's not a professor, then who is this weird lady, and why is she here to talk about sex? And the answer is that I'm not here to talk about sex exactly, but about something else that there seems to be a lot of confusion over, which is the sexual revolution. And in order to get there, let me start by putting on a series of imaginary hats. I'm here first as a wife and mother. That's my most important hat. There are a lot of young people in my life, people your ages, teenagers and young adults, and that domestic fact explains some of the inspiration for my work. In fact, there's no one I would rather speak to than college students. I find them more open-minded about every subject than older people. In 2010, I wrote a work of fiction that Chris kindly just mentioned for exactly this age group called The Loser Letters, a comic tale of life, death, and atheism. And I'm going to show it because the head of Ignatius Press, which published it, is a formidable Jesuit intellectual named Father Fessio. And I think if I don't show the book, he might excommunicate me or something. The Loser Letters is a satire that is in some ways the flip side of what I'm here to talk about tonight. So I just want to say a few words about it. The Loser Letters tells the story of a young woman named A.F. Christian. Little by little, we learn the sometimes bizarre details of this young woman's life. She's writing excited, star-struck fan emails to Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and all the rest of the new atheists, promising and ultimately delivering her own life story to them. As that story unfolds, we start to wonder about this character. Why is she in rehab? And why does she have access to nothing but email, not even her smartphone? Who is this character she calls the director, who's also known as the midget in the red cape? What really happened with her ex-boyfriend Lobo back in Portland, Oregon? These and a lot of other seemingly random details become clear as the story unfolds, or at least they're supposed to. The Loser Letters, not to give away the plot, is a countercultural book about our subject tonight, the sexual revolution. A.F. Christian, as a character, is very much an every girl for our time, a stand-in for so many young women and young men today who share the common experience of growing up with one set of moral teachings, abandoning those teachings as soon as they hit the campus, and then spending years, often the rest of their lives, in what they experience as an existential wilderness. A.F. Christian apprehends clearly enough, to invoke one of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's most arresting images, that someone has indeed taken out a sponge and wiped away the horizon, but she doesn't know what to do about it. And it's in her burning need to do something that the drama of the Loser Letters begins. Here's a second hat to put on. I'm a Catholic. This may not come as a news flash given that the Thomas International Center brought me here tonight, but I mention it because of a couple of reasons. First, as we all know, there is a lot of misperception and ill will out there in the secular universe, particularly toward the Catholic Church. And as a writer, I've come to believe the best way to confront that kind of prejudice and to get the truth out is not by playing defense, but by playing offense. This is all the more important for someone like me who does not write as a Catholic or as a theologian, but rather as someone who uses secular evidence to try and reach rational people on both sides of the religious divide. In this talk, I hope I'll be able to give an example of what I mean by that. Now, here's the third hat, and the one that explains how I got interested enough in this subject of the sexual revolution to write 2 books about it. The second being that nonfiction book, Adam and Eve After the Pill. Here is the little story about how unexpectedly I got started on this road. A friend of mine, the poet and essayist and composer Joseph Bottom, who may be known to some of you, some years back became editor of the magazine First Things. It's a very interesting magazine for those who don't know it. And in 2008, he asked me if I had any ideas for him. I actually didn't, but frankly, I did want to write something, or rather, more candidly, I wanted to get paid for writing something. So I started rummaging around, figuratively speaking, for a subject. Then I realized that that year was the 40th anniversary of Humanae Vitae, the encyclical reiterating the Catholic Church's opposition to artificial contraception. So I thought, this is easy enough. I'll just write an article reflecting on how things look 40 years later, and then I'll get paid, and Jody will get his article, and everybody will be happy. But of course, first I had to do something I had never done before, which was actually to read the document. Now, just so I know who's out there, how many of you have read the document, Humanae Vitae? Okay, doing a good job there, Chris. Those who didn't, I hadn't either. But when I did, the experience had an impact that I couldn't possibly have foreseen. Humanae Vitae, not to put too fine a point on it, is in all likelihood the most heavily mocked and reviled global document of the past half-century or so. It may have been written before most of you were born, but for those of you who are Catholics, you know that it is a living force in the way that people see you as Catholics. To non-believers and secularists, and even to many other Christians, including, of course, dissenting Catholics, this is the document that fixed the kick me sign on Catholic moral teaching once and for all. How on earth, many people want to know, and have wanted to know for decades, could the Church possibly defend the teaching against artificial contraception? Didn't it want to join the modern world? Wasn't it in favor of freedom? How could the Church possibly take issue with the sexual revolution? Now, because I was aware of these prevailing prejudices, I was floored by what I actually found upon reading that document. Humani Vitae makes several predictions about what the world would look like once the sexual revolution really took hold. That is, once artificial contraception was widely destigmatized alongside all forms of extramarital sex. The document said the results would include, among other fallout, a widespread lessening of respect for women by men, a tendency for coercive governments to use the new contraceptive technologies coercively, more broken homes, and a generalized rise in romantic problems between the sexes. These are colloquial ways of putting just some of these points. The reason the predictions amazed me was simple and yet profound at the same time. As a researcher who had studied and written about various aspects of American society over the years, again, for the largely secular press, I knew from all kinds of evidence, from sociology and psychology and elsewhere, popular as well as expert, that all of these predictions had in fact come true. So I assembled a bunch of that secular evidence and I wrote an essay called The Vindication of Humani Vitae for my friend Joseph. It appeared in First Things and it caused something of a stir, to put it mildly, at least in my little corner of the world. The main reason it caused a stir, I think, is that the article ended up being a forthright defense of that document with no holds barred. The subject was new for me. I hadn't written much about religion before that, but I just let the argument go where the evidence led. Instead of apologizing for traditional teaching or playing the game of look here, not there when unpopular doctrine comes up, I tried to face it head on and ended up concluding that not only was Humani Vitae right, but it had been vindicated as few attempts to spy the future ever are, in ways that its authors could not possibly have foreseen, including by information that didn't exist when the document was written, and indeed, even inadvertently and in more ways than one, by many proud public adversaries of the Catholic Church. And the greatest irony of all was that what the Church said was being vindicated by secular sources, secular social science assembled by secular social scientists appearing in secular journals. It was not theology that was vindicating the encyclical, I argued, but secular professors and social scientists like Kay Heimowitz and George Gilder, and a wonderful sociologist named Lionel Tiger, that is his name, and many others whom I could and did name in the piece. Their scholarship about the relationships between broken homes and problems between the sexes and other predictions that appeared in Humani Vitae had gone to show that the document was right. This was an example of playing offense, not defense, in the public square, and it led me to wonder whether there might not be other examples of how secular scholarship sheds new light on traditional Christian teaching. So I started researching down one road after another, and Adam and Eve and the Loser Letters were the result. They're very different books, but they have in common the same fundamental conviction, which I believe is vindicated by the evidence. The sexual revolution has had negative fallout, sometimes catastrophically negative fallout, for men, women, and children across the globe. And the secular world remains indignantly ignorant about that fallout, even belligerently in denial about that fallout, even as the secular evidence continues to mount. So with that in mind, I'd like to move on and talk about some of the myths of the sexual revolution that are out there in our culture today. And myth number one has got to be the idea that contraception is wrong or problematic is just some weird Catholic thing. Nobody else cares. This is what a lot of people think, isn't it? We hear it all the time from friends and acquaintances and colleagues, sometimes family members, including those who come from strong Catholic families. That's how widespread this myth really is, as we saw especially during the debate over the HHS mandate, where a lot of anti-Catholics and embarrassed dissident Catholics had a field day hating on the Catholic Church for sticking to its doctrinal guns. But is it true, as the myth suggests, that concern about the sexual revolution is all just some backward, inexplicable Catholic thing? The answer emphatically is no, it's not, And here's a little history that ought to be used the next time someone throws this particular myth into the public square. In the first place, as many people do not know, it was not only the Catholic Church, but also all the Protestant churches that historically regarded contraception as a sin. John Calvin condemned it, Martin Luther condemned it, and in fact, their particular condemnations make anything the popes have said sound tame. This doctrinal unanimity did not change for hundreds of years, not until 1930 when the Anglicans made the first exceptions to the rule. To make a long story short, most of the Protestant churches then collapsed on the doctrinal point one by one. But as most people also do not know, some of the evangelicals have lately been rethinking this very issue because they have come to believe that Humanae Vitae actually got things right. And you can see this remarkable intellectual transformation if you make a habit of reading Christianity Today and other places where their thoughtful pieces appear. On top of all that, traditional Judaism also condemned contraception, as has traditional Islam. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, also regard contraception as something allowable in only certain very carefully circumscribed circumstances. So in all these religions, the assumption is that babies are good and that treating people like spayed pets is questionable at best and absolutely wrong at worst. So from a strictly religious historical point of view, the idea that concern over contraception and the sexual revolution is just some bizarre preoccupation of the Catholics is wrong, as in factually incorrect. But it's also wrong from a secular perspective. In my book, Adam and Eve, I quote from some pretty towering minds here and there who examined this question of whether the rapid changes in sexual mores would be a good thing or a bad thing for the world. And none of these people were taking orders from the Vatican. For example, a famous journalist and thinker named Walter Lippmann thought the sexual revolution would be epic, as he wrote in a book called A Preface to Morals, which was widely read at the time. And he agreed with the Catholic Church that it was the most important change of the times. Later, an immensely learned scholar named Petirim Sorokin, who founded Harvard's Department of Sociology, actually wrote an entire book, 1964, called The American Sex Revolution, in which he deplored the way the revolution was changing relations between men and women and within the family. As a matter of fact, he went on to say that he thought it would be the most consequential revolution of all times, including even the communist revolution. Considering the time at which he wrote, that was a remarkable thing to say. Try getting tenure at Harvard today with a book like that. Actually, his book makes my book look timid by comparison. Here are three more thinkers from recent decades who dissected the sexual revolution in different ways, all of them very readable, and who argued that it was changing society for the worse. In addition to the authors I named before, Charles Murray, Irving Kristol, and Midge Decter. And there are plenty of other names also mentioned in the book. I recommend all their work to you, and none of them were flags for the Pope. Some of them don't believe in anything, but they know empiricism when they see it. So maybe it helps to remember some of this history the next time someone knocks the Catholic Church's theology and says that the Catholics are just hung up about sex. It isn't true. A lot of smart people working across the centuries on the subject of contraception and the sexual revolution had a near consensus on this subject until practically the day before yesterday, judging by the sweep of time. And here's one more point to make when people tell you this is all just some Catholic thing. The sexual revolution and its repercussions are, in fact, an everybody thing. You could be a Wiccan, you could be a Carmelite, you could be Lady Gaga's biggest fan. No matter what, you are still affected by this revolution in more ways than can be counted, economically, politically, personally, and otherwise, for reasons spelled out in the book. And to give you just one, I think, particularly important example, if you read the front pages of the newspapers or the front pages of the financial pages, you know that for the past several years, the biggest story going is what's going to happen when Spain or Greece, fill in the blank, defaults on their debts and brings down the European Union. This crisis is actually, although not understood this way very widely, a family crisis brought on by the sexual revolution, which so reduced the population of Europe that the welfare states of Europe have become unsustainable, with much the same threatening the United States. That's just one example of a perfectly secular implication of this revolution and its wide reach in our world. So now let's look at myth number 2. The sexual revolution has made women in particular happier. This again is a widespread idea, as you all know. A couple of years ago, when the pill hit its 50th anniversary, or the 50th anniversary of the approval of the pill by the FDA, this was just about the only idea expressed about the event. Namely, that the pill had liberated women from the chains of their fertility, and that the resulting world would be a better world for them. Once again, is it true? I think there's a lot of evidence here to suggest that the answer again is no. In the first place, let's listen to the troops on the ground, as it were. If you scribble for a living or just for fun, and you make a point of reading what's considered to be higher-end journalism, you know, the sort of things that appear in the New Yorker and New York Times and Time Magazine sometimes and all the better papers and blogs, take a look at the pieces that are written about the state of today's woman. They're fascinating. I cite a lot of them in my book because I think what secular women say about their condition in these secular presses is really interesting. What do they talk about? Well, they talk about how marriage is impossible and it's time to go it alone. See the cover of the Atlantic from the past couple of years. They talk about how unreliable men are and how women are better off without them. See the Huffington Post, knocked up and proud by a single mom. They talk about how hard it is to be a single mother and how balancing home and career is so much harder than they thought it would be and how they thought they would be better off than they are, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, they complain a lot. But the way in which they complain tells us something important, I think. This is not the language of women who have been liberated. This is the language of people who have given up on human relationships. It's the language of defeat and unhappiness. And the root of that unhappiness, one could argue, is the sexual revolution itself. Women, especially secular, sophisticated women, have been told all their lives by many authorities that contraception was just a fact of life and that it would help make them happy. They did not understand that, as certain economists, also quoted in my book, put it, the pill and related technologies effectively flooded the sexual marketplace with competition. And once there was all that competition, as it were, the incentives for men to treat women well and to be serious about settling down with just one of them practically disappeared. Like all generalizations, of course, you can think of individual exceptions, but as a society-wide rule, I think the analysis by secular economists of the sexual revolution is compelling. Again, some of the thinkers cited earlier, especially George Gilder and Lionel Tiger, saw this coming years ago. But the unhappiness that permeates so much of what women write today when they're writing of, by, and for themselves is an especially poignant testimony to it. So here's another proof for those who like social science. Are women happier because of the sexual revolution? This is one of my favorites. A couple of years ago, 2 economists from the Wharton School put out a fascinating paper, which was much discussed at the time. It's called The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness. This paper looked at survey data about women, not only in America, but across the Western world over the last 35 years. And what these researchers found really perplexed them, as they write. It was that women seemed to be getting less happy as time went on in self-reported happiness surveys. This simply didn't make sense, or rather, it didn't make sense to the researchers because, as they pointed out, during these same years, women enjoyed many advantages, including, as they saw it, easy access to contraception. Now again, this is one more paradox that isn't really a paradox at all, not if you're willing to entertain the radical idea that the sexual revolution isn't really making women happy. Why not? Well, once again, when hookups are easy to find and people don't fear the consequences because they have the pill to fall back on, a lot of guys just don't have a lot of incentive to get serious about any woman in particular. And look at women who are somewhat older and what they say about themselves. Why do so many accomplished women simply give up and decide to have children on their own, sometimes using anonymous sperm donors, thus creating the world's first purposely fatherless children? Or what about the fact reported earlier this year, or late last year, that 26% of American women are on some kind of mental health medication for anxiety and depression and related problems? The most obvious answer is that something about the way people are living now is making a lot of people miserable. And once more, one could argue, the revolution is the obvious culprit. By making casual sex easier than it had ever been before, the pill and related stuff put new obstacles into human relationships. And since happiness for most people, guys as well as girls, turns out in the long run to have a lot to do with having a companion in life, it's a real problem that the pill has gotten in the way of all that. And that part about the companion has also been studied exhaustively by social science, secular social science. So no, on inspection, I think you can make a strong case that contraception has not made women happier after all. Now let's look at one more myth, final myth, and then we'll just talk. The sexual revolution is a permanent feature of humanity, and there is no changing the fact that the vast majority of people are part of it. Now, here again, I think it is important to play intellectual offense, not defense. Returning once more to the pill's 50th anniversary celebrations in the secular media, it was really striking how many people came up with one cliche after another to get across exactly this idea. The sexual revolution is a permanent feature of humanity. They said the genie can't go back in the bottle. They said there's no turning back the clock. They said we can't go back to the 1950s. And they said the Ozzie and Harriet days are over. And since almost everybody here is too young to know who Ozzie and Harriet are, I will just explain they were characters from this, they were characters from this television show in the 1950s who had 2 kids and a happy marriage, and for whatever reason, people who are rigidly secular are obsessed with these imaginary television characters. I can't explain it. Anyway, all of these cliches, it seems to me, the sheer preponderance of these cliches add up to what Shakespeare called protesting too much. All of them were meant to signal the idea that the way Western society lives now, meaning after the revolution, is somehow inevitable. Now that's a very interesting word, inevitable, because history is in fact littered with movements that once claimed inevitability for themselves and that are now as outdated as typewriters and my cell phone. Think of Marxism. Ask a Marxist if you can find any left who will admit to it. Think about Freudianism, or my favorite example, cigarette smoking. In the Adam and Eve book, I have a whole chapter comparing pornography use today to tobacco use 50 years ago. And let me be clear, I'm not saying they're morally equivalent pastimes, and I am certainly not out to demonize people who smoke. I'm making a different point. In the past half century, not only America, but the entire Western world has done a 180 on tobacco use. And you know that even here in North Carolina. It's gone from being widely accepted. How widely accepted? I can remember when people could smoke in hospital rooms. Airplanes? Yes, I see some nods out there. It's gone from being widely accepted like that to widely stigmatized. And what is really interesting about that change is that 50 years ago, most people must have been pretty resigned to tobacco smoke, whether they smoked themselves or not. most people back then would almost certainly have said that tobacco smoking was here to stay. It was ubiquitous. It was, in some sense, inevitable that the world would be full of tobacco smoke and smokers. Now we know that that wasn't so at all. Smoking has dropped dramatically, again, across the advanced world. You can't smoke in Irish pubs anymore, to take one particularly dramatic example of that change. So here's the question: why? Well, the reason is that people started examining the empirical evidence. The proof that smoking can cause harm was assembled little by little by little, and eventually it changed the way many, many millions of people saw that activity. So why shouldn't we assume that the sexual revolution is comparable? As the philosopher Karl Popper showed in The Poverty of Historicism, brilliant book, history is not, in fact, on the side of movements claiming inevitability for themselves. No social movement gets a special dispensation from history, no matter how badly some people might want it to. Human beings are not only moral creatures, but also rational ones, at least collectively and over time. And the secular record about the dark side of the sexual revolution, I believe, will eventually make a dent. Over time, many people do change their minds when faced with empirical evidence that something causes harm. And anyone who doubts that should try lighting up a cigarette in New York City today, because all the talk about genies and bottles and Ozzie and Harriet will not get you out of that ticket. And that's my closing thought. Thank you very much for having me.